Hi everybody, welcome to the Week 11 Orientation Lecture where our topic is what is public education. My name is Liz Bryant. I'm really pleased to be with you this week where we'll talk about the blurring of the boundaries around what constitutes public education. Our work this week really builds on what you've covered in previous weeks, particularly that foundation idea around the marketisation of education. There's a lot of work being done on what is public education in Australia and abroad, so we're very fortunate to have a really rich body of literature to work from, and it is a global issue. My email address is here for you. You're more than welcome to contact me if you have any questions or if there's anything else that you'd like to add to our conversation on this topic. I work here in the Faculty of Education as a Senior Research Assistant and a PhD candidate. The research assistant work is on the Australian Research Council Discovery Project, where we're looking at private literacy tutoring as one of the edu businesses involved in education at this time. My PhD work is in a similar area. So we're really interested in the way that, that education policy is shaped by edu businesses and the subsequent impacts on families from a sociological perspective. Now, just an overview of our lecture for today. We're going to begin in a classically sociological vein by questioning the assumptions that we have about public education. Next, we'll look at some of the processes and organisations that are involved in the blurring of those boundaries. Third, we'll look at network governance as hierarchies, so the ideas that come from the Week 11 reading by Anna Hogan. And lastly, we'll think about some of the implications that all of this might have for you in your context. So we'll begin by questioning the taken for granted assumptions that we have about what constitutes public education. The assumptions, the taken for granted ideas, those common sense logics that we have. So when I say public education, well, what comes to mind? Your first thought might be related to funding. So public education is funded by the state, but then we can think about, well, what about levies that are paid by parents, those contributions? What about religious and independent schools in low socioeconomic areas that were originally funded to alleviate poverty? Catholic school federal funding began over a strike, over a lack of funding, even to maintain a proper toilet block for staff and students. Now, eventually the Menzies government agreed to some funding, but they didn't hand over the cash right away. So it was actually a small parish in Goulburn who cobbled together the money for that toilet block. And the federal government money didn't come until some time later. But that was a catalyst for sweeping reforms around the way that education is funded in Australia. And we still see those debates going on today. So is it about who pays? Is it about the internal organisation of education? So the structure, the policies, the processes, things like the way staff are recruited, assessment practices, resourcing of public education. We know that it's very complex. Emma Rowe does some fabulous work around public education. She says that we typically think about public education as being non-market, that somehow public education is insulated from market forces. But we know that more realistically, what's considered public has undergone significant reform and it continues to do so. We now have the involvement of many edu businesses. So, with that in mind, we know that public education is no longer a black and white thing. There are no neat definitions of what constitutes public and private. Public education now involves the devolution and outsourcing of many activities that were previously provided by the state. And we have many organisations seeking to influence education policy through public commentary. So our focus today is on understanding some of the private entities that play a role in what we might traditionally think of as public education. Is education still public when we have parents using private tutors, when we have schools purchasing testing programs? You might recognise some of these edu businesses, philanthropics, think tanks and other organisations, and I'm sure that you can think of many more that are relevant to your context. In an environment of converging global education policy, the networks between these large and often multinational institutions and corporations is increasingly being examined. We need to understand the impact that these organisations may be having on the shape of policy. Hirsch and Ball used network ethnography of large education businesses